Welcome to Double Trouble, Macdonald-Laurier Institute's foreign policy podcast series, where we explore the implications of the emerging axis of authoritarianism between Russia and China, for Canada, for our allies, friends, and the world. Double Trouble is generously supported by the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Canada office. I'm your host, Balkan Devlen. I'm the director of the Transatlantic Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and I am delighted today to join by two of my friends and colleagues, Rishi Shimooka and Alexander Lanoszka, to talk about Syria. Rishi Shimooka is a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and an expert on defense policy and defense procurement. And Alexander Lanoszka is a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and an associate professor at University of Waterloo. He specializes on NATO's eastern flank, alliance politics, and how that both those things relate to Canadian defense and security policies. Gentlemen, welcome today.
Thanks for having me.
So what we want to talk about today is a bit of a self-serving podcast series. We just have a piece published at the Hub looking at the implications of Assad's fall in Syria for Russia and for its ability to project power globally. Most of the credit for that goes to Richard, who did an excellent job in drafting that piece. So we're very glad to be part of that. So I just want to start for the audience, just to give a sense, Richard, I'll start with you. Just give a sense for the audience of what was Russia's involvement in Syria, especially after the Syrian civil war started. And then we will get on to the implications of what the fall of Assad means.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I think it's important to understand, I don't think that Russia and its predecessor, the USSR, had a stronger ally than Syria. I really struggle to think of, maybe Cuba might be the only other one that really kind of comes to mind at the same level. If you think about in the 1970s, 60s, and into the 80s, Russia was one of the largest provider of arms to Syria. We see various conflicts where the Soviet Union at the time had provided basically some of those advanced systems it had to Syria, and in exchange for its political support. So there's a long historical sort of relationship there that you can't really deny existed. Coming into the Arab Spring in the 2010s, Russia really was one of the key parties to support the Assad regime. Without, especially in the 2014-2015 timeframe, Russia's support probably saved the regime as the Syrian Democratic Forces sort of pushed from the north into the south. We remember Aleppo and some of these sort of struggles, where Russia has ostensibly tried to claim that this was due to counterterrorism and the threat of ISIS. In the initial phase, they were pretty strongly going after the sort of Syrian Democratic Forces that were really threatening the regime. So they've been a core part of sort of maintaining Syria's basically the Assad regime in the power. Certainly, that's not to deny that Hezbollah and Iranian influences have been pretty strong at important parts of that as well. But the decisive sort of movement, especially in 2015, was the use of Russian air power to sort of solidify the regime forces. They backfilled a lot of positions behind the lines in order to allow the Assad regime to basically optimize their ground forces to conduct for sort of the roles at the front, and sort of maintain basically the integrity of the regime up until just a couple weeks ago here.
No, I mean, so I think that's quite important, particularly the role of Russian Air Force played in the destruction of Aleppo, including the war crimes and potentially targeting and helping the Syrian Air Force use chemical weapons, etc. On the Syrian civilians. There's always, of course, and we can talk about that, the implications of it later on. But there's always the notion of Wagner forces, the Russian private military company, the mercenaries, providing training as well as actual ground forces to work with Syrians and various militias affiliated with the Assad regime and Iran and Hezbollah, has been quite effective and important in pushing that, especially in that period of 2015 to 2017 area where they actually sort of push that quite a bit. And so we can always go back into the details of that. But I think it's important to highlight that the Air Force, the air cover that actually not only the Russians provide by bombing the civilians and and the rebel forces, but also denying the airspace to other actors, right? The need for deconflicting mechanisms when Americans are operating, the basically denying of the airspace to Turkey, for example, to carry out operations in the north, etc., have always been an important part of providing that support to the Syrian regime overall. So, Alexander, let me turn to you, and we're going to get back to sort of the dynamics of why in a minute, why sort of Vladimir Putin's regime did not sort of come to the rescue of Assad and just basically whisk him away to Moscow at the end. But what does it mean? So Richard sort of highlighted the importance of Syria in terms of the Middle East. But when you look at sort of bigger picture, what was the importance for of Syria and Russia's bases in Syria, both naval and air force, in terms of Russia's first as an image of a global power, but also materially its ability to project power outside its immediate neighborhood.
So I would say that there are several implications that we can tease out from what's been happening over the course of the last several weeks. The most obvious one is the implications that the fall of Assad has for the image of Russian military power. One can recall in 2016, that's the spring of that year, when Russian-based orchestra performed in the ruins of Palmyra. I believe Vladimir Putin himself gave a televised or pre-recorded address to the audience sitting amongst those ruins. And that was the high watermark of Russia's military and political support to the Syrian regime. And it was very, very much broadcast around the world to demonstrate that indeed Russia was a very serious player in the Middle East. We're very far removed from that particular moment 8 years forward. Russian military and political influence is just not anywhere near at that level back in 2016. I think the point you made, Balkan, earlier about deconfliction is an important one. There's a subtle angle here in the sense that one reason why Israel has been very moderate, as it were, vis-a-vis Russia was precisely because of the perceived need to have Russian cooperation to go about deconfliction as regards to its own operations in Syria. And we have seen since October 7th, 2023, that Russia not at all is Israel's friend, that in fact it has been more or less supportive, if not diplomatically, perhaps even materially, of Hamas, to say nothing of Iran. And all that has led to the deterioration of Israel's own security situation, but precisely because of what Russia was doing in shoring up Assad. The Netanyahu government was reluctant to really go after Russia. Now that consideration is more or less absent. We have been hearing voices from members of even the Likud party being much more vocal against Russia. I recall some leaders saying that once Hamas is done, they're going to go after Russia. I'm not sure how serious they are, but that has a little more credibility than perhaps what was the case before the fall of Assad, precisely because that one consideration that might have tied Israel's hands is simply not there. And of course, the last one is that one argument for why Russia was going about its military intervention in Syria was to basically broadcast on behalf of its own arms industry. We know that the Russian arms industry has been struggling, not least because the kit used in Ukraine has been prone to all sorts of technical issues, to say nothing of the tactical failings of various Russian military units. So it does cast more of a pall over the nature of the Russian military industry, to say nothing of Russia's own military power. But I'm sure Richard has some of his own thoughts to this effect, thoughts that we have indeed expressed in the Hub article that brought us here today.
No, excellent. And I would repeat this again, and we'll put it on the show notes that our audience should go and check out the hub.ca for the article itself. But let me turn to you, Richard, again on Alexander's point, both in terms of the implications sort of beyond the immediate concerns about Russia's ability to project power, but also for the image, its defense industry, and also if you can give the audience a bit of a sense of what are the assets that that Russia is leaving behind or being stripped off in a way when they have to leave the bases, both the naval and air force, and why we need to think more beyond sort of not only Syria but beyond in the Levant, in Eastern Mediterranean more broadly, including North Africa and further on.
Yeah, so just to pick up on that point, one of the motivating factors, it seems, of that 2015 intervention was to potentially test out some of the new systems they had been developing since 2008 after the Georgian War, standoff precision weaponry, aircraft that are able to operate using newer sensor systems and being able to undertake sort of just newer, sort of more modern types of operations than what had been previously displayed by the Russian military, and that was a really critical sort of aspect that a lot of analysts had pointed out of their operations in 2015, 2016. Obviously, I don't think that's a major consideration anymore, given that we're now coming up to 3 years here into the war in Ukraine, and so that obviously that isn't as important. But I think that the base in Tartus and Commune certainly are critical. Were important sort of bases, not just for projecting power, but if you think about the access to the Mediterranean, because the Bosporus and sort of Turkey, Tartus was a really critical sort of location that allowed them to sort of avoid some of the issues at any one time. They had several frigates based there. They've disappeared. Apparently, there's some talk that they're going to Libya right now. Aircraft. Well, we don't know. So I mean, it's still, this is still a bit of a fluid situation. The aircraft that we've seen at the airbase have started. We've seen them, a large portion, disappear, and you've seen a lot of transport aircraft coming in and removing equipment. So whether or not that is going to exist, or they're going to go to a very small footprint to sort of avoid political ramifications, I think is an important. It just shows, just as I think we described it, as a fig leaf of presence, and I think that if you're operating bases in a country that really doesn't want you there, it really just diminishes any sort of value you have to actually use it as a military base. We can, if we think about the Americans and some of the operations like Turkey in 2003, if the state doesn't want you there, then it really limits your ability to use it for anything. So I think that just the change of regime has completely altered its ability to sort of be a presence in the region. Now, maybe they'll try to find some support in Libya and try to build out the base, but it's not going to be anywhere to the level of sort of support that they had, excuse me, with the Assad regime in the past 40 some years.
And I mean, also with the Libya thing, it's not as if you can, almost on next day delivery order a naval base. And given the fact that the whole sort of contested nature of who controls what in Libya, Haftar and his allies might be interested in, but there will be a lot of more pressure coming
And
through.
if you think about it, if you are undertaking sort of coercive measures from a base, who wants to support that? Like, is Algeria going to support that? Is Morocco, any of these, I would say, lukewarm sort of allies that they have in the area? Nobody wants to be seen in that kind of way, and nobody wants to be sort of the base of support. Assad didn't care because for Russia's in his case, Russia was supporting his regime. So but in those other countries, they're yeah, sure, they'll play the diplomatic game, but they're not going to go very much further than that. So I
No,
think that's a
no.
pretty big
Yeah.
shift in position.
Yeah, I mean, they don't want to go necessarily to the bat for
No,
Putin. I mean, there's no upside for Egypt, for Algeria, for
absolutely
even
not.
Haftar. So I want to get back to sort of what might be going forward, the implications of it. But one thing I think, to me, at a more sort of perhaps a meta level, to understand about the Russian reaction to the Assad's fall and the way they just sort of almost scurry away, is I don't want to call it Russia as a paper tiger, which is not, from the death and destruction that it brought to Ukraine and elsewhere we saw. But it is also important to note that the image that Russia tries to cultivate as this reliable ally that would stick through you and would use necessary means to keep you in power and have ways to reach into your country and change things and will be there and cannot be defeated, is also a crumbling component. And I think this also goes through Putin's in general foreign policy and structure. He does change tactics. He alters his trajectory, and he will withdraw and adopt policy when he's pushed and when the calculation is not there. So I think that sort of bravado on the one hand that they wanted to present, and unfortunately a lot in the West sort of buy into, saying that Russians will tough this out, and of course they will be there and willing to incur costs, etc., may or may not necessarily reflect reality when it comes to the unwillingness to do that. Alexander, you have been looking at sort of the alliance politics more in general, not only sort of the relationship. When you look at Russia's alliances, they're not in a way, but relationships, including Syria and others, what can we deduct from both the historical experience of how Russia do these things, but also contemporary understanding of Putin's take on alliances and allies across the world, and how we need to approach that from this experience?
So I suppose my general view is that these sorts of military and political commitments to Putin don't really matter as much as one might think they do. Yes, it hurts to lose Syria for the propagandistic reasons that we discussed and how it does represent an ebbing of Russian influence in the region and beyond. But at the end of the day, Putin cares first and foremost about the survival of himself and his own regime. We have seen this happen before, even this past decade. And I don't mean Ukraine, but I also mean with respect to Armenia. Right? Armenia has lost a major war against Azerbaijan. There were Russian peacekeepers deployed there. They turned out to be useless. Eventually, Azerbaijan would relitigate that war by taking the rest of Nagorno-Karabakh and leading to an expulsion of all ethnic Armenians who had lived there up until basically last year. So the response from Russia, there was not really much of a response. In fact, Armenia has been more or less cognizant of that lack of response and has decided to suspend its obligations to the Collective Security Treaty Organization. I think even within Central Asia, more generally across other parts of that alliance, there's a sense that Russia is a partner with which to reckon because they're in Central Asia. Their options are fairly limited. They don't have much room for maneuver, but they also sort of see for Russia for what it is. It's not a credible security guarantor as perhaps made out to be, even though it was not that long ago when Russia had intervened rather successfully to quash violent protests in Kazakhstan. So all that is to say, it's nice for Putin to have successful military commitments abroad, especially when they deliver these propagandistic benefits. But the actual cost to him personally is not that significant. I think he's actually okay with it. And I think sometimes we exaggerate in the West how much he would feel these costs, and that leads us to negotiate against ourselves. If Putin loses in Ukraine, he can still retain in power. Ultimately, that's what he cares about. And so I think we just need to be very much mindful of that. What's going to be interesting in the coming year is that the economy is in shambles. That is to say, the Russian economy is in shambles. And
ours too, but that's at a
ours too, but I would like to still think that our macroeconomic prospects are much better than a heavily sanctioned country. Bear in mind, Russia has a population of 100 million people, more people than we do, and their GDP is still less than Canada's. So that's a poor country, in other words. It's a poor country. Pardon me?
It used to be equal. Yeah.
Used to be equal.
And as you see this collapse.
Yes. So this is a poor country with many, many, many nuclear weapons, especially of the lower yield variety. It's still a large country. It's still got human capital, to be sure. it has these commitments, as in the Caucasus and parts of the Middle East and North Africa, but it's not looking good from an eternal perspective. And so that, I think, was what really would matter for Putin and his own personal calculus. I do think, to be sure, his position remains secure. He has successfully coup-proofed the regime, and I don't see a viable contender anytime soon. That being said, these things can happen very quickly. If you and I can predict Putin's future, chances are Putin himself can predict these things. These things are inherently unpredictable. No one predicted revolution in the cases that we care most about historically, precisely because there was some sort of X factor involved. So I'm not saying something is going to happen in 2025, but the prospects of the Russian economy are pretty dire, and they don't bode well for the country's future whatsoever. That has to have some sort of long-term implications for that country. A country like Russia is not going to have the sort of economic situation that it does while losing many, many men on a daily basis, mind you, in a war with Ukraine that has very few positive prospects going for it, at least as far as Russia is concerned. It has to be some sort of consequence, but whether that'll be in 2025 remains to be seen.
No, I completely agree. I mean, also the implications of this for how we need to think about Russia, Russian strategy, their belief that they can convince the West that they can outlast and they have more stamina, and therefore we should just give up now and throw Ukraine under the bus because they will tough it through. I think that's that narrative. I mean, we all question it, but I think that has to be questioned at the high levels. And what is happening, what happened in Syria, are actually examples of the fact that maybe they're not going to tough it out, and they have a lot more problems. I want to ask two last questions. One for Richard, and then one for both of you, thinking more thoroughly. For both of you, the question would be about, so what does this mean for Canada? What we need to think about our engagement in the region, as well as how we perceive Russian policy and power. But before getting into that, Richard, so what's your take when it comes to and I don't want to really get too technical here, but Russia's ability, including its private military companies such as Wagner, or their sort of reincarnation as Africa Corps in Africa, etc., their ability to project power in North Africa and beyond. What does this mean? I mean, they love their Nazi imagery with Wagner and Africa Corps. So that tells you all you need to know about the mentality. But what does that mean for their ability to sustain those things and their operations in Africa? And then if both of you can comment as a last component on what it means for Canada, and then we'll wrap up there.
Well, I mean, one point we didn't talk about in the article, which I wanted to point out, was things haven't been going well in Africa either. I mean, they've lost a bunch of Wagner troops in Mali, I believe it was, just a couple weeks ago. I mean, you see a lot of these operations, they're facing some pretty significant pushback from local forces or local militants. So, maybe that's a price that Wagner and the Russian government's willing to continue to pay. I'm not too sure. Uh, Projecting is may not be as hard. It really depends on how much a sort of a government's willing to allow aircraft to transit through. That those are generally not as difficult to undertake. If you're not actually undertaking direct military force through them, you're just I'm just passing troops through. That's those generally can
It
be.
gives Turkey a lot more leverage, especially in terms of both the air
Yes.
and the sea transports to Libya through the Turkish airspace or whatnot. So
True enough. True enough. I would also say that Iran has provided them quite a bit of sort of the tightening of relations between the two countries has allowed a bit of that as well. So there are some options there. It's certainly a little bit more tough going forward here. It'll be interesting how this continues. One of the things I really wanted to sort of highlight is that I think Russia, because it's financially, as we just talked about, its military forces are stretched, and its resources that's able to contribute to other countries is kind of limited. Like, you aren't seeing the same arms export, defense diplomacy continue at all because they're using every single thing they've got to support their operation in the Ukraine. A lot of their client relationships are starting to fray a bit, and I think that that's sort of, other than the countries that are actually direct providing them arms, like I said, Iran or North Korea, the Algerias, the sort of the Central African sort of lukewarm allies, they're not they don't, because they can't get the same client support. They're sort of left adrift, and I think that that's this discussion of sort of the, not disintegration, but fraying maybe is the word of the sort of the Russian uh, the Russian influence across internationally in sort of more the hard power or sort of medium power sort of terms, where you think about the military support, the training, the arms. That I think is starting to become apparent a bit, and I think that that will have consequences going forward for a lot of these conflicts, a lot of this sort of the stability of some of these states, and because it just can't, they just they can't get, these countries like a Venezuela just can't get access to the sort of the cheap arms as they once were, and then so they're looking around, and their opponents on the ground may well be able to get arms from other sources at a lower cost, or to be more effective, I should say, in their conflict. So I think that that was one of the dynamics that was becoming a little bit apparent in the past couple of years and going forward here.
That's quite interesting. Alexander, what does this mean for Canada?
Well, so it depends on how many resources we are willing to commit to the problem. That is always the question. But in simple terms, I would say that this is a reminder that Russia, or really Moscow, has been a power in decline really since the late 1970s, if we're being honest.
Yeah.
And only the hike in gas prices and oil prices have masked some of that long durée decline. This is a great power that's basically no longer really much of a great power in either sense of the term. Like I said already, its gross domestic product is less than that of Canada, to say nothing of other countries like Germany and South Korea. So it is a reminder that Russia's power is not inevitable. It is a reminder that Russia can lose military commitments and we will still survive. It is a reminder that if Russia can be beaten back in Syria, rather quickly too, no less, similar things could happen elsewhere, most notably in Ukraine. This is, of course, a war that has been going on for over 10 years now. Of course, it has seen significant escalation in 2022, and we've been living in that zone of escalation since then. But it goes to show that even in this conflict, Russia's victory is not inevitable whatsoever. Its forces are highly strained. Yes, of course, Ukraine is suffering tremendous amounts of pain, and there's a lot of uncertainty to be sure. But again, Ukraine still remains in Kursk for whatever reason. Russia, despite having North Korean assistance, is unable to expel those forces. So we should disabuse ourselves of any notion that Russia is a great power that is capable of imposing its writ. That's simply not the case. And so, as we did point out in the piece itself, this should actually lead to a doubling down of support for Ukraine. Whether it would, I'm not sure. I'm doubtful, in fact, especially considering the fact that in Canada, we've more or less maxed out what we could provide to Ukraine, and we have actually been maxed out for quite some time. But ideally, that's what I would like to see. But of course, there are lots of unknowns, not least because of the person coming to the White House or coming back to the White House. Although I just saw a Financial Times article to the effect that the Trump administration does see peace through strength through the lens of actually giving continued military support to Ukraine, which was actually something considered back in November by a number of Ukrainian officials. They were dismissed by many critics of Trump, but that actually may indeed be the case. We have to remind ourselves that it was the Trump administration that gave Ukraine its first lethal assistance from the United States.
Yep.
No,
and apparently he's proud of that. I mean, that's something that he's actually quite happy that he.
It was a token amount, but yes,
absolutely.
Yeah. The Lithuanians got a lot more javelins the same year, I believe, despite being a much smaller country. But it broke that psychological barrier, as it were.
It shows the intention, right? Rather than this sort of obsession with escalation management of the Biden administration, and which is basically for foreign policy purposes, practically the third Obama administration.
It's the image, and just give me a sec. I mean, I think there's a number of people that are coming into the Trump administration that are far more hawkish. They don't see this escalation management as an issue, and if they are given the opportunity, the ability to basically give Ukraine whatever they want, they're happy to do so.
Yeah.
They see that
We'll
much
see.
more. Potentially, no, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, Tulsi
think
Gabbard
there's-
being DNI is not exactly
Yeah,
possible.
I agree, but I think there's a lot of people that are associated with the defense side that are what you would consider realists, and they don't see it as they see the military strength portion as being the core component of this. So
Yeah.
I can see I can go.
Yeah, no,
I don't think it's
I
I don't think it's clear.
yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
I think to wrap things up and to bring things full circle, if Putin's wager is that Trump is what's going to save him because of despite all these military setbacks in Syria and elsewhere, that's not a foregone conclusion.
No, 100%. That's what I'm
No,
saying.
no, I completely agree, and I think the Russians themselves are also aware of that. I mean, there was some level of comfort with the predictability of the Biden-Sullivan line. They know that they would be able to do things, and the Americans are not willing to cross certain things. That's not necessarily the case with Trump. So I think having been beaten in Syria, the real 3-day special operation, if you look at it, to take out Assad, is going to be an important part if we learn the proper lessons that, as Alexander pointed out, Russia can be beaten. They can go back, and Putin can survive. It's not like I'm gonna go in a blaze of glory sort of structure for Putin. That is the image that he would like to project, and it worked because of our insecurities and other things. But I think that's very well shown in Syria. I'm going to wrap up here, but thanks for both of you joining, and for the audience and for you as well. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. This is probably the last episode of Double Trouble for this year. We will come back next year. Once again, thanks to our sponsors, Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung Canada office that makes this the podcast possible. Please do go ahead and read the hub.ca, the article, and which Richard regularly writes, and you should also read the other articles. This is one of the most fantastic sources of news and commentary you can get in Canada. So please do so, and continue to follow us in the new year as well.